Welcome to our SBC Issues 24 group interview for our SBC 24 presidential candidates. I'm Bobby Gilstrap, and I'm the host for the group. And our SBC Issues Q&A group on Facebook have submitted questions that we're going to be asking Bruce Frank, who's our guest tonight, as well as the other candidates that we've had. But first, let me give you kind of a quick overview, just so you'll have some idea. We're going to be covering most of the major topics that we have had surfacing over the course of the last year. Some of them span over multiple years. We'll be talking about the views on abuse reform for Pastor Frank. Also, progress of the GCR, the Great Commission Resurgence, possibly views on the impact of the McRaney versus NAM lawsuit case and its impact on religious liberty, continued pleas for transparency, which we've seen surfacing and resurfacing over these past few years, the law amendment, and much more. We basically have three kinds of questions that are asked, questions that come for all of the candidates that are submitted by the group. Sometimes we'll have some questions that are unique to the individual candidate based on some position he's taken or something that he's, spoken about in the past at some point, and then maybe additional questions from viewers live as we continue with the interview tonight. Well, his biographical information is will be in the biographical section there below in our video description, so you can check on that and see his background. But we want to jump right on into our interview tonight. And as I do that, I'm going to bring Pastor Frank on. Just remember to make sure and subscribe and like the video. That way you'll be alerted to any previous videos that we've done, but also to upcoming videos that relate to SBC issues and ministry issues relative to smaller attendance churches, as that's who we focus on. Well, we're glad to have Pastor Bruce Frank joining us today. We're glad to have you joining us, Pastor Bruce.
All right. Thank you, Bobby. Good to be with you.
Well, we had a little bit of a misfire to start with, so we're kind of rebooting tonight to get started. So I apologize for the delay on that, but we're glad to have you with us tonight. Let's jump right into our questions as we get started. We are going to cover a number of these things, as I've just mentioned, and we'll try to hit them as quickly as possible and move through. But we want to make sure that you have ample opportunity to be able to kind of give your position and give your kind of state your case as to your view on some of these issues that are facing Southern Baptists. And if you were elected to be the next Southern Baptist Convention president, you would obviously have to be facing these and be really down in the dirt relative to many of these topics. But let's begin by simply asking, what makes you similar to or different from our recent SBC presidents like Bart Barber, who's our president now, or Ed Litton or J.D. Greer? What's similar and what's dissimilar?
Well, I mean, I think with any brothers in Christ and it's all our tribe. I mean, we're in the SBC tribe, so there's certainly a lot of similarities. I think the world of all three of those men. I know all three of them. Very grateful for them. Grateful for. I mean, leadership can be lonely, and those men served the Southern Baptist Convention very well. They love Jesus. They love the gospel. They love their families. They love their churches. They've all got pretty long tenures. Pretty long. I'm not sure exactly what Bart's is, but Ed's and JD's is a long tenure at the same church. And, that speaks super highly of somebody. You're there over decades. That just speaks so highly of them. So again, alike and different. We're certainly alike in a ton of ways, but also different. Like brothers, we're going to disagree on maybe some of the minor issues, but we would agree on the major ones, I would think.
Yeah, very good. Well, when you look to the future, and we're going to talk about some of these major issues, I want us to kind of focus on what we've been calling Baptist Bill in our series of interviews. And Baptist Bill is a member of a normative size Southern Baptist church, runs maybe anywhere from maybe 50 to maybe 100 on a Sunday morning. But Baptist Bill has never attended an annual meeting, so he doesn't know much about all of the things that have been going on in recent years. And I want you to try to talk to him to help him to understand the depth of these issues and why they are so important to us as we move forward. So let's start off by talking to Baptist Bill and help Baptist Bill to understand what happened with the GCR, the Great Commission Resurgence. What is it, and then what happened with it?
Sure. Well, I mean, in a nutshell, if I was talking to Bill, I mean, what Bill knows is the Great Commission, first of all. I mean, he knows Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, the marching orders Jesus gave his church. People think of it as just Matthew, but it's in all the Gospels in the book of Acts. And it was the Great Commission. Resurgence, again, is just it was an attempt, or is an attempt, to focus on the main thing, which is the Great Commission. Because as I've said in a little video last week, 100 years from now, the souls of men and women are what is really going to matter. I mean, there's other issues are very important, very important. We're going to talk about them. I've made numerous statements on all the important issues, but the Great Commission is the one that organizations tend to drift from. We tend to drift inward and not, become focused inward. And there's many examples in the Bible of that. It would be like, even like in the book of Acts. I'm rereading the book of Acts over and over again. And I was reading like chapter 1, and it's verse 4. It says that Jesus was with them for 40 days explaining or talking about the kingdom of God. So think about this. I mean, he's got the early disciples 40 days talking about the kingdom of God. And yet 3 verses later, they're like, hey, but what about us? What about Israel? So there's that natural, and not about them. It's about us. It's about me and mine. And then that's when he gives in verse 8 another version of the Great Commission. And then if you even notice in the book of Acts, they still stay in Jerusalem for the next 6, 7, 8 chapters until persecution. And then in chapter 9, Paul gets the gospel out. So all that to be said, I think what this was an attempt to do, Bobby, and is an attempt, is to keep focus on something that we naturally drift from. Organizations naturally drift from the mission, whether that be the SBC, whether that be a local church, whether that be whatever. We tend to drift away. And for churches, the danger of that is of the main things that church is to be about. I mean, when we talk about our church, we exist to glorify God by making disciples of Jesus who reach up, reach in, reach out. And so the reach up, worship, that doesn't really drift. I mean, they might argue about it, and we might have different opinions about that. Reach in is community, that doesn't really drift. But the reach out, that's the one that drifts. And when it comes to, I think your question was, is it been successful? All that kind of stuff. And I would say, Bobby, the jury is out, but I would also say facts are our friends. Facts are our friends. There was even obviously a lot of data that came out this afternoon that I guess everybody was getting about some ACP reports, and even there was some encouraging things, and there was some things that obviously need a lot of work, and all of that is, you got to put that in the context of coming out of a pandemic and all of those things. But again, I think you have to try to stay focused on that, because it's like I always think about like the tide. When you go to the beach, there's an undertow or there's a drift that'll take you one direction. You've got to work against that. And I think, again, when it comes to the GCR and all those things related, the attempt was to keep the focus. If I'm talking to Bill, I'm just saying that it's an attempt for a convention, which is a large amount of people, a large amount of churches. I mean, it's like herding cats. I mean, how do you get that many people with that many opinions to focus on that main thing? And you and I were talking before those technical difficulties. I'm indebted to Baptist Bill, because straight out of seminary, I mean, we were at Blue Grove Baptist Church in Blue Grove, Texas, which, I'm not exaggerating, this is not preacher talk, that there was not a stoplight. I think the first stoplight was 5 years ago, because some friends from there on Facebook's like, we got a stoplight. And the joy and unity that comes from a church seeing gospel life change is unlike anything else. Obviously, the eternal significance to that person, but whether it's a prodigal or a coworker or a family member, I mean, when that church sees a person repent and embrace Jesus and then follow up with baptism, there's just nothing like that for the life of the believer, obviously for the person that just embraced Christ. And so, again, if I'm president, or if I get that privilege, I mean, one of my first calls would be to the state execs and the area associational people, because, Bobby, as you probably know from leadership, and you've done, as you said, a number of interim pastorates and things like that. You've been on the mission field. You've got a lot of experience. And I know one of the leadership principles you've learned is, usually the best answers come from those that are closest to the front lines. And so I would say, for me, one of my first calls or Zoom calls would be, they get the state execs, get associations, like, what are those churches that have gone a while and haven't been able to celebrate the Great Commission and the fruit of that, because that brings more unity and more joy than anything else. And you get enough of those. I think we have around 20,000 that haven't seen that in a while. And I just know in Blue Grove, Texas, it was cool when I put that little video out a couple of weeks ago. The current pastor of Blue Grove Church, he got on there and he's just like, we baptized 2 on Sunday, and I can affirm that what he was just talking about is true. And so again, you get enough churches like that haven't experienced it in a while. That changes a convention, and the convention changes, and then a country changes. But it does go back to, whether it's a Great Commission, Resurgence, whatever efforts, we've got to figure out. There's some encouraging data today that came out. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it, with some baptisms being up and some things like that. And that is certainly good news. Again, it's coming out of a very crazy season, but at the same time, there are some good indicators there.
Yeah, it seemed like there were some positive signs, although we still had a 17-year, I think, decline overall as far as total membership, that kind of thing. But you're right. The church where I'm transitional pastor right now, I got a message today where we have a baptism Sunday coming up in just a couple of weeks, and we now have 4 people to be baptized. A lot of these were folks that we've been reaching out to for months and months and months, and they hadn't baptized anybody in at least 5 years.
Really?
In that congregation. So
they're seeing 4, and they're seeing 4.
Yeah. I got 4 baptisms on Sunday, and so one of those is a couple. The wife is a new convert, prayed to receive Christ in my study just a week ago Wednesday, and her husband, who's been kind of walking away from the Lord, wants to be baptized again. He was baptized as a child. He just wants to be baptized to show his recommitment to Christ. So, that's exciting as well to see he's wanting to put his feet down and be moving the right direction in that. Yeah. Well, look, all of those things are good, and we can look at the data. And in looking at that data, what is your kind of gut about what we need to do different? What needs to change? But before we started pushing the GCR, we had an emphasis called GPS, and the GPS emphasis was about serving, and it was all across the convention. And a number of our conventions had really spent a lot of time kind of spinning that up. The North American Mission Board was pushing that, but it seemed to just kind of dissipate and go away. It was an evangelism emphasis. And when the North American Mission Board changed over right after the 2010 convention, things seemed to drastically change, particularly with the North American Mission Board. What do you think needs to change, and how do we explain that to Baptist Bill as far as a direction to move us back in the right direction now?
I'm not 100% sure I understand your question. But in general, what do we need to do to move back and to see more evangelism as the actual emphasis?
Yeah. What needs to change for there to really be a Great Commission? Well, I'll put it this way. Chuck Kelly, in his book, you've probably read Chuck Kelly's book that he wrote about the GCR. And he said this wasn't really a Great Commission resurgence. It was a Great Commission regression. And now, Chuck Kelly, former president of New Orleans Seminary, but he's very much a statistician, and he had tons of data that he used in that, and had lots of charts and stuff in his book. But he just showed that things have been regressing, half the number of church plants rather than as many as there had been prior to the GCR. A lot of things like that he had stated. And he even stated that he felt like there was an intentional move to centralize control in the convention based upon what has happened since the GCR. So that's a lot, but how do we turn that around?
Well, I don't think there's a magic wand. I don't think there's a silver bullet, so to speak, for if there's one thing. Obviously, a lot of what takes us away from that. If you look at it, that's the stated purpose of our convention, evangelism and missions. That's the stated cooperative effort, that we do have. And so I actually haven't read Dr. Kelly's book. I've heard about it. I've seen synopsises of it. I think I've seen some summaries of it. But again, there's so much data information out there. I would say, when I look at, let's take NAM, for example. And again, there can be discussions about what's the best way to do leadership and what's centralized, what's not. I would say from my seat, Especially over the last 5 years, what I see like Dr. Ezell doing and having guys like Vance Pittman and Matt Carter and what Dr. Chitwood is doing. I mean, I have a lot of confidence in what they're doing leadership wise. And I think especially what we're seeing in regards to church planning is going in the right trajectory. I saw some of the stats today because, you know, and you're having some churches that are, not rejuvenation. What's the word I'm looking for? Where they, churches that maybe either merge, where they get together.
Revitalization. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like Bud Unzinger of North Carolina. I mean, there's some great stories of churches that, let's say, were, you know, one more generation away from, you know, closing their doors. Let's say maybe merging with a church plant that has people but no facilities, and those are some beautiful marriages. So I don't think there's a one size fits all, Bobby, to cure everything. We didn't get in this situation overnight. And then you put it in the context of, you know, in the U.S., we're one of the few areas in the world where Christianity is not exploding. So there is a cultural aspect to it, you know, and there's an SBC aspect to it. So again, I don't think there's one silver bullet, but most definitely, you know, there are pockets where you see some tremendous things, just like what you just said, that's happening in your church. We've had the largest number of salvations and baptisms in our church we've ever seen in the first 4 months of the year. So in some ways, I think, you know, in the next year or two would be maybe even better data because it'll be post-pandemic. Some of the stats you saw today were in comparison to a very unusual circumstance. So again, I do think there's several things we have to do, but the bottom line is that where we're going to put our forces? There's some things that are pushing us back. There's some division. There's some lack of communication. There's some lack of trust on some parts. To some degree, you know, it's a little bit new because the division, and this is a different question, but, you know, 20 years ago, some of the division wouldn't be out front because it would be conversations maybe, but now with X, you know, Facebook, Instagram, a lot of times things can be blown up a little bit more than maybe they are.
Right. Oh, yeah. A few people can make things look very large sometimes. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, let's move on beyond the Great Commission Resurgence, but let me ask you this one final thing as we transition away from it. We've got a task force that was put in place after this last convention that are going to be reporting back to this convention's annual meeting. What is your hope? What do you think that GCR Review Task Force is going to say to us?
You know, I'm not sure where I don't know what they're going to say. I would say I'm sure it'll be good because they've worked on it hard and there's some talented people on all these task force and they usually end up being the subject matter experts. But I would go back to what I said a few minutes ago. I mean, honestly, the answers are with the pastors because the pastors and then the pastors who know the associational guys and the associational guys that know the state guys. And I say that because every community is a little bit different. And while one church maybe is going through a period of not being able to see a lot of fruit, it could be very different than over here. On one hand, you might have a pastor that's burned out. On another hand, you might have, you know, governance issues. So there's not one issue, but I do think they'll come out with some good suggestions, but I would still pivot back to say the best answers are as close to the front lines as we can get, which I would say going back to first call would be state, associational, but that's only because they know those 46,000 pastors. I mean, Bobby, you know, like the church you're transitional pastor right now, you know those issues and what you're obviously already seeing fruit. I don't know how long you've been the transitional pastor, but you said it'd been 5 years before. So the Lord does the saving, but he also uses leaders and pastors. And so, you know, even as a transitional pastor, you know that church better than the best intentioned task force person, the best thing they're going to come up with. Bobby Gilstrap knows that better. So the question is, how do you really get Bobby to speak into what he knows? That's my opinion.
Yeah, I get it. Well, look, let's go ahead and take a change. We mentioned the North American Mission Board just a moment ago, and the McRaney versus NAM case has been going on now for about 7 years, right at 7 years now, has now just been taken back to the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and oral arguments happened with that just before that. prior to those oral arguments actually happening, there was an amicus brief filed by some 65, I believe it was, Southern Baptist leaders from all different levels and ranks, from a local pastor right on down to other positions within the association, state conventions, and the executive committee, former executive committee leaders as well in the convention. And on our podcast, we did an interview with Randy Adams, who was one of the guys that coordinated all of this. I want to play just a quick clip from that and get you to respond to his comments that he makes in regard to this whole situation and what's going on.
Sure. NAM is claiming that religious liberty is at stake. Jenkins said their argument actually undermines religious liberty because it violates the religious liberty of Will McCraney or of any other pastor or church leader or convention leader that believed that they were interfered with or defamed by an outside organization. There's no First Amendment protection for an outsider interfering with your church because your church is autonomous from all outsiders.
So basically it forms a connectionalism, which could be of danger, obviously, in a torturous situation like you're talking about in hiring or firing at that point, and control of other entities over, a local church or an association. But it also could have a great impact in the sexual abuse cases that we're seeing surface. It could be just about anything. Bruce, we alluded back to the connection with the abuse cases, and of course, you've had a lot of involvement with that. But how do you see this kind of playing out as far as these arguments at the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court?
Yeah, and Bobby, this will be a quick answer because I don't. You know more. You obviously and Randy know more about it and have followed it closer than I have. All I would say is it sounds like, from what little I've read a few articles on it. Your concerns appear to be very valid. Obviously, the autonomy of the local church is Southern Baptist. We hold that very, very tightly. So it sounds like your concerns could be very valid. But I don't really, not a lawyer, hadn't followed it other than
right. No. Yeah. Well, and that's a fair disclaimer we should put across the screen real fast. Neither of us are lawyers, so it's more our opinion on what we know. Well, one of the arguments, I'll just get you to respond to this because of the ramifications of this, and it has really concerned me about. I use the term in that clip, connectionalism, kind of putting together a connectionalism, saying that all of our autonomous organizations among Southern Baptists are connected. And part of that's because of the language that the North American Mission Board has repeatedly used, both in the Northern District of Mississippi, the Supreme Court, and now the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court. Both times they've been there at the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court, referring to themselves as the SBC Mission Board, talking about the Baptist Church, the Southern Baptist Church. Of course, we know there's not the Baptist Church, that we're all independent churches, autonomous churches. But the concern there are the ramifications that possibly that ruling would have on any contractual agreements, because what happened in the oral arguments. In fact, I tell you what, let's jump ahead real quick. I'll just get your feedback. Hang on, let me pull that back off. Let's go back here real quick and let's see. No, that's all commercials. Okay. This is part of what he was stating in that the argument. Barry Hankins, this is from the depositions that were taken prior to this court case, related to the court case, but not in the oral arguments. It said, Barry Hankins, who is a Baptist historian from Baylor, said, if NAM's interpretation of the First Amendment prevailed, every Baptist entity that cooperates in any way with the SBC would be put at risk. He continues and says, it is my opinion as a scholar of church-state relations in the U.S. that NAM's First Amendment defense, in this case, if accepted by the courts, would actually undermine religious liberty rather than safeguard it. Then from the transcripts of the actual oral arguments that happened on April 4th, this is Attorney Gant responding to the NAM attorney, Mr. Martin, and he says, Mr. Martin seems to be suggesting that somehow because BCMD, which is the Baptist Convention of Maryland, Delaware, and the North American Mission Board agreed to do some work together, that immunizes NAM from claims Dr. McRaney on the notion that he cites Watson for this notion of implied consent. So what he was basically stating there is he basically was arguing that because they signed a cooperative, they don't call it a cooperative agreement now, used to be called Cooperative Agreement. Anyway, whatever the new name is, I forgot. But the agreement between the states of how they're going to share the cooperative money, that kind of thing, and what they're going to support, because they had signed that kind of a document, that put the state convention under the governance of basically the North American Mission Board, and that was his argument. There was implied consent; they had to be submissive to that government. So obviously, pretty entangled, but that just was really concerning to me, especially knowing how the North American Mission Board had apparently intentionally misrepresented multiple times the way Southern Baptists actually operate and our polity.
Sure. No, I mean, I understand your concerns. Again, not being an attorney, not wanting to be an attorney. I mean, I guess that's why they cost so much, because they're going to untangle all that stuff. So,
right.
Again, I understand the concern, and I understand, autonomy is certainly a huge part, and it's very different than, I think, pretty much any other, whether we're in a denomination or a convention, that's always,
right.
that's up for debate now.
Yeah.
But it's different than, virtually every other, whether it be Methodist, Episcopal, Catholic, whatever. And so it is, to some degree, unique. So it'll be interesting what the attorneys do with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's follow up with one more question that one of our group members asked about this. Does any SBC entity have any rights or privileges over a state convention, association, local church, or a Baptist minister or staff of any of these?
Well, it doesn't sound like they, I mean, again, rights or privileges over a state convention. I mean, the local church is the Southern Baptist Convention, and the associations, obviously, they're to resource and to come alongside, but it's a volunteer cooperation. So if I understand it right, I don't remember reading, I must have missed that on the questions, but if I'm understanding it right, it doesn't sound like it.
Okay. Yeah. And that goes back directly to that case, is where that question, I'm sure, stemmed from, without any question. Now, let's continue on. Let's we're still looking at the North American Mission Board issues. The Cooperative Agreements is what I just referred to as what they had prior to the Great Commission Resurgence. And one of the members, actually Randy Chestnut, I believe it is, up in Ohio, I believe, is the one that asked, would you support returning to cooperative agreements for NAM and all non-South state conventions?
Okay, again, and I was listening to part of the deal with the discussion with Clint and trying to get, I think that goes, how far back do cooperative agreements go? Do you remember when those were switched over?
Many decades. Yeah. They were called that up until the GCR passed and the North American Mission Board switched that.
Sure. And it sounds like my understanding was where the monies go north, south, different things like that. So again, that seems like a many faceted thing on how do you basically, who gives the money, where does the money go? So again, that's probably a whole discussion in and of itself. So I would say, again, right now, that it goes back to probably the initial question that you have to ask is, what are we here for? We're here for the Great Commission. So how do you, North American Mission Board obviously is U.S. So how does, I know there's a question about cities and rural and
right, yeah,
it kind of goes into all of that. And again, Bobby, people are people, and so I think you have leaders that will help you figure out, and they need to be accountable leaders. And we'll talk about transparency and so forth in a few minutes, I know. But I mean, leaders are supposed, if leaders are leading, they're leading with the framework of how do we get the gospel to lostness, and they're looking at tons of data. They should have a lot of discussion, a lot of buy-in, and it goes back to the trust. When there's a lack of trust, usually stems from a lack of communication, and with a lack of both of those, then there seems to be, whether there is or isn't, a lack of transparency. And so discussions like this seem like a few hours around a table would solve that, because again, if the goal is to get the gospel to lost men and women, with NAM's case, in the U.S., then, I mean, really, who cares whether it's in the North or the South? I mean, lost is lost. And so if we have a Great Commission mindset, but again, I don't know the details because you said it was decades ago.
Right.
I'm not sure why those got terminated, why those got switched, why the name got switched. So again, I can say, if, it seems like that would be something you should be able to solve with with some relational equity. with
Yeah,
somebody
yeah.
else.
You would hope, and I believe there have been many efforts of state convention leadership, state convention executives, that kind of thing, that have tried to work that out. But look, you kind of set us up for our next question. We want to talk about some of the issues of transparency. Let me set it up first with this brief clip with a couple of associational missionaries where they're talking about the issues of trust and transparency. Let's get your response on the other side of it.
Okay.
I think things like that really harm the relationships that should be strong in the SBC. And as somebody said, I don't know who it was originally, but relationships move at the speed of trust. And if we don't have that in place, there's going to be this sense of, I don't know how much I can really buy in right now, how much I can really support. And maybe we pick and choose what we feel safer with than what we don't. And so I think that's quite a bit of what's going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, Bobby,
yeah, go
I
ahead.
don't know who's saying that. I don't know who's saying that, but and nor who originated the quote he said, but I would 100% agree with it. He said relationships move at the speed of trust, and that's true no matter what organization you're in. That's true if you're pastoring a church or if you're leading an entity or whatever it is. I 100% agree with that, and I would then agree to say that for whatever reason, it's whether the information was there and not seen or not ever offered. Again, you know this, Bobby. If people don't have the information that's needed, they'll make up their own narrative. And so,
Yeah,
you know, again, facts are our friends. You know, if there's nothing, you know, put the information out there. At least make it available. Now, obviously, when you're dealing with massive entities like whether it be IMB or NAM or whatever, I mean, you're talking enormous amounts of information. So then the question goes, I mean, do you put out a telephone book? But you know, the thing is, it has to at least be available. I mean, that's where, and I think I was listening to one of your other podcasts, and it's like you talked about the SBC business and financial plan states that entities are to do that, which actually was, I didn't know it was that clear, but you know, if those are the rules, you got to play by the rules. And so that seems, you know, pretty obvious. So I'd say either way, you have to build back when there's no trust. You know, it's like anything, like a marriage. You know, if there's a lack of communication, little things become big things. And the same way, if there's a lack of communication, if I do it with my church, if I'm not communicating, whether it be some initiative or a building or something like that, I mean, I'd rather give them more information and them saying, hey, you know, like even in our church, like personnel team is who I work with the closest. I mean, my goal for them, and I've been here 15 years, and I don't think my goal is to never have them be surprised. You know, never. I was like, hey, we heard that such and such is not with us anymore or whatever. And what that does is that builds trust, and you go through that a long enough time. So I segue back to say, I'm not sure whose fault it is, but there is some degree of lack of trust, which ends up probably coming from some type of lack of communication, which means, hey, we got to have some more transparency. So transparency is great. I think the question is, you know, how do you do that? It's concerning if the trustees, you know, the systems are set up for this, but you know, if you can't get information from a trustee, which I've heard a few times, you know, that would be concerning. Or some people said, I can't even find out who the trustees are. That's super concerning.
Right.
So, you know, those are valid reasons to say, hey, we got to have a better line of communication.
Yeah, I would think it raises concern about transparency if the first step in trying to get help is you can't find the list of trustees. It's like, I mean, that's hidden. You can't find out even who to call.
That would be a yellow flag. Hey, we got to find out who do we call to call. So
right, yeah. There's no doubt about that.
And how much, you know, and obviously, you know, trustees should be looking at a phone book of information, whether it be about salary structure or whatever, you know, and he might have more information, but at the same time, you have to have some more information given to the messengers than apparently what is either they're not telling where the information is, or it's not available. I'm not sure which one, but either way, if the messengers want more information, you need to give them more information.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think that is a consensus among many in our convention. It has been a recurring theme of wanting to get more transparency. And you mentioned having seen several incidences where people have sought out information like salary structures, things of that sort. And that has happened over multiple years now, both in the annual meeting, as far as on the floor of the annual meeting, where messengers have attempted to get more information, as well as in many other situations, individuals, directly to the entities, or in smaller meetings as well. What's ended up happening of that is last year at the convention, we had two motions that were presented, and you're familiar with this. I'd like to get your response back on Rhett Burns had one of the entities that, or one of the motions that has been considered. He asked that there be a Form 990 type reporting. He's not asking that the Form 990 be submitted by our entities to the IRS. That is the form number. But he's actually asking, hey, look, there's a lot of information there that is just normally asked for from Planned Parenthood and all these other nonprofits that are asked to make this information public through their 990 that Southern Baptists aren't getting. And there have been some objections to that. And we have a link on our particular channel where we interviewed Rhett, and he's done several interviews discussing this. But what would be your kind of argument for or against? Are you supportive of requiring our SBC entities to be able to complete at least that kind of reporting to have available to the messengers?
Sure. I mean, the type, I'm not an expert in Form 990s, but I mean, I know what they're asking for. And I would say, again, if the messengers want that, they should be able to get it. So if the messengers want to vote, if the messengers want to vote on that and they vote to have it, then I have no problem with that at all. Again, I do have a lot of trust in the leaders. They're at least the ones that I know. I don't know every single one, but I certainly know most of them. And so I have a lot of trust in them. I think at minimum, again, we are where we are. And so can we go, is it better if we'd have gone back a few years ago and gotten the information or made it where you couldn't miss it? Possibly. And is there some potential cons? Potentially, but we are where we are. So I think, again, if the messengers want that, then by all means, we can provide some type of form like that gives the information that they're asking for. At the same time, having maybe some of the professional advice to say you might keep, you might have X, Y, and Z, but certainly we're not to that point yet. We need more information is being asked for by the messengers, so you need to give more information.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of things on the 990 you would not disclose, like the donors and things of that sort. But if there's foundations or large entities of some sort donating, then those kinds of things should be made public. There's no reason to hide that as far as some kind of funding that's coming in other places, or like in the case of Send Relief. Most people are unaware that Send Relief is receiving hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, from the government now to help support its work, which is, if you read strictly, it's kind of outside of our business and financial plan as far as receiving money or raising money from other sources. But yet they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to solicit that kind of thing. And if that's going to be done, okay, but I just think our messengers should be aware of that. They should know where that money's coming from and how much of that's coming for that. So, without a doubt.
Well, your case in point is, especially in this information age, that information is going to get out. And when it gets out via, however, like that information came out, as opposed to from the proper channels, then it breeds, what else am I missing? And so, again, I think, again, more information, the better. I go back to my personnel team. I never want them to hear, hey, this student pastor is not with us any longer. What happened? I mean, I'm like, I want to be on the front end of that, letting them know, here's this, here's the situation, help me with this, that kind of thing. And that breeds trust. So if I do make a mistake or I don't tell them, then there's a lot of trust. And right now there's sort of a trust deficit that needs to be built up.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair statement for sure. In line with that, let's take a shift. Let's go to an area that you have had a lot of experience with here in recent years, That is the area of abuse, as we've looked at abuse recently and had a lot of issues related to this. What is your view, just kind of in a general sense, on the issue of abuse within the SBC? Kind of where are we?
It's a great question. I would say over the last, especially since about 19, which is before I got involved, I would say since about 18 or 19, I would say there's been a lot of good things happen, particularly at the state level and associational level, a lot better awareness, a lot of good, again, I go back to a lot of the state task forces, training and equipping and the ministry toolbox that came out, and a lot of those things that have come out. Pastors are making the right phone call when that unfortunately does happen. They're making the right phone call now because, as I said before, pastors don't grow up being trained for this, especially depending on if you're 40 and over. You didn't have any classes like this in seminary on what do you do when you get that phone call. And sometimes our instinct was wrong. And I think historically we can show where sometime our instinct was wrong. I would say over the last 5 or 6 years, we've all learned a lot. We've all gotten a little better instinct to make the proper call on how to care for survivors, those type of things. So in a lot of ways, there's been some good movement and awareness and equipping. I was a little concerned, and I'm not sure how good the data is, I would say, but like the data that came out today, there's some of the conventions have been filling out on the sexual abuse. And like one of them, I can't remember all the stats, but the one that surprised me, and again, that's new data, so I'm not sure how crystal clear that is, but according to the report that came out today, only 58% of the churches do background checks on people that work with students and kids. And I'm like, okay, that's not an acceptable number we can be comfortable with, because background checks, it's not a cost issue. It's not every single person can do that. And so maybe that percentage is actually higher. I hope it is, but that would be an example. We certainly have a good way to go. And, Bobby, this is not just a church issue. This is a cultural issue. This is a cultural issue, and it doesn't stop at the steeple. So it does come in the church. And the church is uniquely vulnerable because of the ministries we do, whether that be a preschool or children's or students, volunteers. So we're uniquely vulnerable. I would say the part that concerns me the most, that actually got voted on by 90% on the messengers back in 22. And I'm not saying it's easy. It's not. I'm just saying Southern Baptists can do hard things. And the big gap that is not accounted for right now is because if you look at the stats, and even if these vary, a little bit, but almost all the stats show a couple of things that are concerning, that abusers have an 80% recidivism rate. That is, they're going to, if it's, and take that, there's only like 3% of abusers that actually are convicted, and only about 6% that are ever arrested. Now, again, you can play with those numbers and say, well, those aren't quite accurate, but let's just double those if you want to do it, or triple them. And what you still have, though, is you still have a gap of somebody that has either been fired or let go off of something extremely questionable. And maybe that's happened 2 or 3 times, but it hasn't warranted an arrest. Of course, now you've got the mandatory reporting, which has helped, but still, when you get up to that area, the concerning part is there is that ministry checkpoint. And I guess the question you've got to ask, and I mean, this might or might not be a fair, actually, I think it's a fair question. If somebody were to ask you or some of the people that are really against any kind of ministry database, would they be comfortable with a person who maybe has been let go of a couple of volunteer positions, or possibly fired from a position that didn't get arrested? But maybe there was something very immoral several times over working with their grandchild. I mean, people say that's not a fair question. That 100% is a fair question, because that's somebody's grandchild. And their grandchild is no less important than, somebody else's grandchild. Right. And so that's the part, to me, there's a gap there. I'm not saying it's an easy answer, but I can't help but to think you get the entity heads I mean, the attorneys play a role. They play a role. They do play a role, but attorneys work for us. They work for us. We don't have to do, that can't be our only thing we think about.
Right.
And I think the main thing is we have to think of this. This is a huge part of our mission. This is not a ancillary thing. This is a part of our mission. And as I said a couple years ago, I mean, it's really hard for us to tell a watching world, Jesus loves them, when we will not go to whatever is necessary to protect the vulnerable. And I think the gap, just statistically, there is a gap there. I think if you put the entity heads, you put the people around the table, there can be something that it decreases that person that is short. Because again, 3 to 6% of arrested and convicted, that leaves a lot of people.
Yeah.
That, and one last thing, I mean, people like this, one of the things I learned on the task force with that recidivism rate is I always go back to think about the Jurassic Park movies where you've got those raptors, they're going at trying to see where the lines down, where the gaps in that security. And they will go from church to church, and then all they got to do is find one or two, and all of a sudden, somebody doesn't have these things in place. So I say all that to say we've come a ways, for sure. I think we've done some substantive things on the awareness level, on the training level. We still have got some ways to go. To me, the big gap is in some type of what is short of arrest or conviction, but at the same time, unsafe for kids and students. That's the gap.
Well,
it's a big gap.
I was just going to say, within the SBC, there's no question that, I mean, this is a very emotional issue, and it's extremely personal. If someone has been impacted directly in any way, shape, or form by this, whether it be them individually or somebody they know closely, a family member or something of that sort. So it is a very emotional issue. But do you feel like it's fair to say this is a systemic problem, or do you think this is a systemic problem within the SBC?
Well, I mean, what's the word systemic mean? It means system. And when you looked at the investigation that the convention asked for was unfortunately shortened even by a couple of months. And so, but even what you saw our leaders, or some of our leaders. I mean, an example would be our council back in 2007, saying, listen, we have to get a ministry checkpoint. We have to do this. We can do this within polity. But we have to do this immediately, and yet the other council saying we're not going to do this. And I think is abuse a systemic problem? The leaders are part of our system, and some leaders did not do. I mean, the question: did we do our best? We did not do our best. Does that mean that all the leaders were bad? Certainly not. You definitely saw a propensity to be more concerned with the fallout than the survivors. You definitely saw that. I don't think that can be denied, that you saw a protection of the brand to be the first concern, that instinct, versus survivors or making sure that guy doesn't go down to the next church. Again, systemic doesn't mean everybody was guilty. It doesn't mean there's not tremendous people. It doesn't even mean it's a very small minority. But again, if you're talking definitions, leaders are part of our system, and some of our leaders made very poor decisions that I think grew and grew and grew. And just like we talked about anything, it's going to grow, and it finally it's like a beach ball. You tried to hold onto the water, and listen, that thing is going to come up. And, it'd have been great if 25 years ago, some of these things were maybe dealt with, but now it's a cultural crisis, I think, and it doesn't stop at the church. Doesn't stop at the front doors of the church. But again, big picture, some good things have been done, particularly since like 2018, 2019. There's still a big gap. The culture has changed some. Right. So I think some of it's going in the right direction with that very glaring gap, in my opinion.
Okay. Let's talk about the current shifts. We've had some shifts now to where it was announced by the executive committee, or at the last executive committee meeting, that they were going to start, or there had been started, I guess, technically, an abuse response commission they call the ARC. Is the creation of the abuse response commission a viable solution?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me start it by saying since 2022 in Anaheim, I've not been part of the, I'm sure, thousands of hours that have gone into this. So I haven't been privy to those discussions. I haven't been in those rooms. I haven't been in any of that.
Right.
From what I can understand, you basically kind of have two options, one inside the SBC and one outside the SBC. ARC would be kind of outside the SBC. And I would say, Bobby, there's pros and cons with either one of them. I don't know enough detail to say which one has more pros and which one has more cons. The one inside the SBC, maybe lacks some subject matter experts that could be used. I know for me, it was a massive learning curve, a cram course in just the year that I was a part of it. So, there's some catching up to do. I'm sure there's some subject matter experts that are within the SBC. But on the other hand, SBC, we tend to be more comfortable with people. We're uncomfortable with somebody outside. So again, pros and cons of inside. I think the two things are, can you have something inside the SBC, maybe a part of an entity? I know different options have been done, or something that's outside, ARC being outside. So again, I don't know enough detail about ARC to say that would be by far the best one. I'm saying those are the two options, but I would go back to my initial one. I'm convinced that if you get the people around the table, nobody is going, abuse is not just a deal stopper for the survivor. And that's the first, that has to be our default thought. That has to be our default. But I think those entity heads, they get around the table, and I think as leaders, they also have to know, if we handle this poorly, this is a deal stopper for them. And we've seen that. We've seen it. We've seen the damage to people that has taken place because we didn't handle it right. So again, I'm convinced that if we get the right people around the table, it might take I'm not saying it's easy, but SBC has done hard stuff before. I'm convinced that they can come up with some legally wise, survivor sensitive, insurance doable ministry checkpoint. Because like you mentioned, the transparency with Planned Parenthood, and how can they do it and we can't do it? I will say the same thing with sexual abuse and a ministry checkpoint. You've got Catholics that do it. You've got sports organizations that do it. You've got other people, and we're the ones that we know that people are made in the image of God. And we're like, we cannot say too hard. It's too difficult. Shame on us if we do that. I think we'll end up figuring it out. It'll be hard, but it's vital to do that.
Well, the funding has been an issue that has come up repeatedly. One of the questions, we won't probably have time to unpack all of the questions that we had looked at originally, but one of the questions someone in the group had asked basically was, hey, look, when I give my money through my church that goes to the cooperative program and it's scattered out throughout the entities and that kind of thing, how do I know my money is not going to pay off some kind of a legal, something with an abuse case or something else? Obviously, the concern is, here my church in ABC, Georgia, shouldn't be having to be responsible in part to pay off some kind of a settlement for a church in ABC, Texas or California or wherever it may be at that point. And that goes back to our autonomy, the autonomy of churches and the lack of connectionalism as far as, we're all responsible. And that's, I guess, part of the concern with NAM using the Baptist church kind of language at that point. So if you become president, you're going to have some influence. You get a seat at the table, as you've said, around many of these things. And the issue with The ARC is still kind of up in the air as far as exactly how that may play out, that kind of thing. But what would be your thought as far as who should fund something like the ARC if they move forward with something like that? I know the ERLC kicked in a big chunk, to start with when they were doing this, and I don't remember, the number was enormous that's been paid out so far, I think, in the millions of dollars, and what's been spent relative to the abuse situation at this point. But where do you think this money is supposed to come from?
Yeah, well, I would let me go back to what you said. I haven't seen any recommendation from a task force that has said Church A needs to pay Church B's legal fees or payout. I think the question has been about the entity leadership. All right, if we have these leaders and they've done something wrong and we're cooperating, what is that about? And so, when it came to our task force, the reason that, let's say, Sin Relief said, hey, at least the database part of this can be part of our mission, is because I believe one of their 5 pillars in Sin Relief has to do with protection of women and children. So it certainly falls within that mission scope. And so again, the legal fees and all that kind of stuff is, nobody's saying or at least I haven't heard him say, Church A's got to pay Church B's legal fees. When it comes to, when you have a ministry database, I think the question is that part of our mission? You think about associations, they train, they equip. That does cost some money, just for the fact that an association is putting on a conference. That takes some money. So again, I don't want to comment on who's going to fund the ARC, because the ARC is not even really, it's not even passed yet, so to speak. I mean, it's passed in some regards, but let's figure out what the final version is, because I think it does make a difference. Is this in the SBC? If it's in the SBC, there's a funding model that's, in my mind, fairly simple. If it's outside the SBC, I do think the funding model gets more complicated because of just, it kind of gets outside of our cooperative effort. And so, anyway, I don't want to do hypotheticals, but there's a way to do it.
No, it's always hard to do the hypothetical. I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Well,
look, we're running out of time, so let's make a kind of a hard right away from the abuse situation, and unless there's something else you think of to bring up relative to that, let's talk about another issue that has surfaced, and we'll come back to this convention. Let's help Baptist Bill understand this. What is the law amendment, and why is the law amendment controversial at this point?
Sure, and I would say start off a couple of things. I'll try to give a big picture answer. I've got some detail answer either at brucefrank.org, or I put a longer one out on Twitter a couple of months ago. So, and since then, a number of other people have chimed in on their concerns.
Good.
So here's what I would tell Bill. I would say, not to get into complementarianism and egalitarianism, but us talking, I would say, a true egalitarian is probably not, is not going to, they probably need to find a different tribe than the SBC. The SBC is unapologetically complementarian, that God has made both man and woman in the image of God, but made them distinct and different with different callings and those kinds of things. So that's who we are. And that's who we've been for a long, long time. That's where we're going. That's where the vast majority. I mean, I think even when you take the title of pastor, I think they found 1,800 churches, which sounds like a lot, and then 1,200 churches, 1,800 females with pastor in their title. And while that does sound like a lot, and I'm not saying it's not something we don't have to address, that is less than one. I think that's 0.027%. They say that less than 1% is statistically an insignificant number. So I'm saying that I would tell Bill, we want to address it. It's not statistically, it's not the urgent one. I would say, secondly, we've proved, even though it was messy, we have proved that there is a mechanism, particularly in the BF&M 2000, that this is clear. So I would start off by saying we are clearly a complementarian denomination. I would say the concerns about the law amendment, other people have spoken to the cooperative effort and stuff, and they've done a great job on that. Randy Davis at Tennessee came out with a good one. A number of guys have come out with a number of
yeah.
My concern with the law amendment, and the reason I don't think the law amendment is an improvement of what Adrian and those guys did back in 2000 in the Baptist Faith and Message. There's several reasons that I think that the law amendment is a downgrade, and that if we're going to express our complementarian in a clearer way, then we can do much, much better than the law amendment for a couple of reasons. I mean, reason number one would be, it does not, because the question was, okay, what's a pastor? And my contention is that the law amendment does not tell you what a pastor is. It doesn't. People are like, oh, it does, right? It does not tell you what a pastor is. There's a lot of things that the Bible tells us to do as church members, and then there's certain things that it's just for pastors. So the question is this, when it says, do not appoint, employ, or affirm a pastor of any kind, is that about the title or is it about the function? And the reason I think this is super important is because if it's about function, we have not defined what is exclusively the function of a pastor. And, and Bobby, the question then is, because the primary text that is used is 1 Timothy 2, 12, 13, and 14. And it says, teach or exercise authority over men. And is it teaching or is it exercising authority? And obviously it's kind of both and it's individual, but it's obviously connected somehow to eldership or pastors. And when I look at that, I believe that if it's passed as is, first of all, I believe we can do better. Secondly, it raises more questions than it answers. It doesn't answer the question. I actually think what IMB puts out is at least closer, because it talks about pastoral leadership and teaching. So it's saying that, listen, there is a way a pastor teaches and a pastor leads that's much more like, the elder, pastor, bishop synonyms that you see in the Bible. So I guess in a nutshell, I think we can do a better. My main concern with law is it's going to lead to extra biblical actions, because it's a pastor of any kind. It's not a red hair. I'll give you this. Let me just say one. I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, that's okay.
But here's the deal: is there's some people who are very strong proponents of law. Not all of them, for sure. Some of them have very clearly indicated they would take law and go toward the function and say, okay, even if a lady does not have the title, if the function is a violation of Scripture, that would be something we would go after. My problem with that is we've not defined as a convention what are the exclusive functions of a pastor. So what is it if you have a children's director who has male volunteers or even male employees, and she is to some degree extra? Some would say, well, no, that's not pastoring, and that's and again, this is not a red herring. This is not a Trojan horse, and here's why: because the theology behind extra biblical, I would call it extra biblical complementarianism. There was a presidential candidate. I know I'm not going to say anybody's name, but I'm saying there was a recent presidential candidate in the SBC who was asked the question, based on your theology and your interpretation of 1 Timothy, would you allow a female to be a chairman of a committee in a Southern Baptist committee? He's like, absolutely not. And then it was very unclear whether or not, in his mind, any female could be a part of any Southern Baptist committee. Now, somebody might say, well, that's not part of law, but I would say it certainly could be construed that way by saying affirm a pastor or pastoring of any kind. So those are my concerns in a nutshell. My big picture is, if we're going to, I think we do need some clarity. I do think because of the culture is blurring the lines. If we want to improve what they put in the BF&M, I understand that. This is not an improvement, in my opinion. This is a downgrade and doesn't provide the clarity that was asked for.
So let's take that
Okay.
and build on that very briefly as we're wrapping up. This has to be passed by the convention messengers 2 years consecutively. Last year, it received, I think it's somewhere 80-something% on the floor. So it has to come back for a second vote this year, which is anticipated to happen.
Yep.
if it passes, do you think that's going to have a positive or negative impact on the convention?
Well, I mean, I'm against the law amendment because I think the law amendment, I think, will have a negative impact. What I'm not saying, though, is pragmatism leads doctrine. I'm not saying that. Okay. I'm not saying we don't do it because we're afraid of churches leaving. I don't agree. I mean, I think doctrine has to rule. We do have a book. I do believe that. I'm just saying that the law amendment, I mean, it takes a lot to say the law amendment is equal to Scripture, that if you disagree with the law amendment, you're disagreeing with Scripture. I mean, that takes a lot of whatever to say that. I would say we can do better than the law amendment in expressing our complementarianism because of the reasons I've just stated. But because the law amendment, in my opinion, is poorly written, it will have a negative impact because once it starts going into extra biblical actions, which many proponents have said that is the intent, then I think it will have a negative impact. But I do think it's highly solvable. Let's put a better statement out that exclusively, again, Baptists believe that elders, bishop, those leaders, those are to be qualified men by Scripture. We're not egalitarian. People that are egalitarian, that small number, they're going to be more comfortable. And by the way, that number is probably going to go down because some of that number, I've already seen some of that number of those 1,200, some of those are not even, they don't even consider themselves Baptists. They have long gone. We just got to clean up the records. So that number is going to go down. I do think we have a mechanism now that's better than law, but I think if we want to improve it, we can improve it even more. It's just not the law amendment.
Okay. Do this for us, Bruce, as we're wrapping up. Kind of give us a nutshell. Why do you want Southern Baptists who were messengers at the 2024 annual meeting to vote for Bruce Frank? What do we need to vote for in that first round ballot? There's 6 of you there, but
it's probably going to be a runoff. And again,
I would probably will.
I've explained. It took a while to. I mean, you could tell I was somewhat late to the game in putting my name in. It took a lot of time to even put that. I felt like I'm obedient to put that in there. Certainly, the messengers do, what they want, who they want to vote for. And by all means, I would say just look at the things I've tried to state where I stand, what I think is important. Again, BruceFrank.org has those 4 priorities, 4 things that I think are very pressing. This is where I stand. I think because of the task force, as well as trying to be very upfront. Listen, this is what I think is important. This is the way I've led the ministries that I've been privileged to lead. I think by God's grace, we've seen a lot of fruit, and I think the fruit that I've been able to see in the ministries that I've led, I want by God's grace other people to experience that because it is so joyful and so rewarding to see those things. And so I would go back to the fact that, my first call, my first meeting is going to be, man, how do we let those churches that are like, can we see life change? Can we see those waters flowing? Can we see what you're seeing, Bobby, in your church in a few weeks? How do we see that again? I mean, I'd love to see I'd just love to be a fly on the wall in the church that went 5 years without seeing that, and now they're seeing 4 people baptized at the place you're at. I mean, I envy the joy that is going to be in that room. So that's what I'm going to be about, as well as those other very important things. I didn't list 10, I listed 4. You can see them there on how I tried to articulate them. So that's why, don't vote for me if you don't think those are important. I would say that, but that's what I do think is important. I think those will stand the test of time, and that's what I'm about.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight. We definitely are going to put a link in the video description to your website so folks can look at that and look at it a little closer. We're glad to have you joining us tonight as we have our other candidates as well.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
Well, stay tuned. We will have more videos coming up as we continue to follow things within the SBC. They're all a part of what is happening, and you need to be filled in and be aware of that. All of these videos for these interviews are put on a playlist. You'll find that list below in the video description.